world as it once was no longer exists. In its place lies a planet shrouded in perpetual gloom, blanketed by endless rainfall. Day and night are indistinguishable, the skies perpetually ashen, casting the earth in a dim, gray pallor. For decades, the sun has been nothing more than a memory, a myth whispered by the elders to children born in the darkness. The rains began subtly, an inconvenience that turned into a catastrophe, drowning entire cities and reshaping the landscape into a sodden wasteland. Humanity, ever resourceful, learned to survive, but the cost was unimaginable. Nature, stripped of sunlight, adapted with a vengeance. Plant life turned sinister, evolving to thrive in the absence of photosynthesis. Bioluminescent fungi blanketed the ground, their faint blue-green glow providing the only illumination in this sunless world. Massive, carnivorous plants emerged, their tendrils reaching hungrily for anything warm-blooded that strayed too close. The animal kingdom was no less affected. Creatures once familiar to mankind had mutated, their forms grotesque and their behaviors predatory. Survival meant constant vigilance, a battle not only against the elements but against the creatures born of the dark. Humanity itself was forced to change. The rain was more than water. It was corrosive, toxic, carrying with it microscopic spores that infiltrated and rewrote the DNA of those exposed for too long. Those who lived in the open transformed, their bodies adapting in horrifying ways to endure the relentless downpour. Their skin grew thick and scaly, their eyes enlarged to see in the dim light, and their limbs became elongated, allowing them to traverse the flooded terrain with an alien grace. They were no longer entirely human, and they became known as the adapted. The adapted were both feared and pitted by the remaining human enclaves. These settlements, huddled in the ruins of skyscrapers or carved into mountains, were bastions of unaltered humanity. Shielded by ancient technology and ingenuity, they relied on massive dome-like structures to keep the rain at bay. The dome's inner walls were lined with the last remnants of artificial light, creating a pale imitation of daylight. Within these sanctuaries, life clung stubbornly to normalcy. Crops were grown under LED lights, and water was purified through intricate filtration systems. But the resources were finite, and the walls could only hold for so long against the relentless assault of time and nature. Eli was one of the Watchers, a group tasked with guarding the perimeter of the last surviving enclave, known as Bastion. Tall and wiry, with scars tracing his forearms like roadmaps, Eli bore the marks of countless encounters with the adapted and the other horrors of the outside world. His watchtower, perched at the edge of Bastion, gave him an unbroken view of the endless rain. Through his binoculars, he scanned the dark horizon, searching for threats. The adapted often ventured close, drawn by the faint warmth and light of the enclave. Some came to trade, bringing rare and strange goods from the flooded wastelands. Others came with darker intentions. Eli's shift began like any other. The rain pounded against the reinforced glass of his tower, its rhythmic drumming a sound he had long ceased to notice. He adjusted the focus on his binoculars, his sharp eyes catching movement in the distance. A group of figures, hunched and distorted, trudged through the knee-deep water toward Bastion. He couldn't tell yet if they were adapted or merely desperate scavengers, but he activated the warning beacon, its orange light cutting through the gloom to alert the enclave's guards. The figures drew closer, and Eli's stomach tightened. They were adapted. Their elongated limbs moved unnaturally, their gait a strange mix of fluidity and awkwardness. Eli grabbed his radio, his voice steady but urgent. Group of 6 adapted approaching from the north. Possible threat. Awaiting orders. The response crackled through the static. Hold position. Observe but do not engage unless provoked. Eli nodded to himself, his eyes never leaving the approaching group. The adapted stopped just beyond the outer boundary, their glistening forms barely distinguishable in the rain. One of them stepped forward, raising a hand in what seemed to be a gesture of peace. Against protocol, Eli opened a small hatch in the tower and shouted through the roaring rain. "State your business." The figure's voice was garbled, a rasping, guttural sound that barely resembled human speech. "Trade. Safe passage. No harm." Eli hesitated. It was rare for the adapted to approach with peaceful intentions, but it wasn't unheard of. Some of them retained fragments of their humanity, enough to barter and coexist in uneasy truces. Still, the risk was enormous. "Wait here," he barked, closing the hatch and relaying the situation to the command center. Minutes later, a small delegation of guards arrived, armed and cautious. They allowed the adapted to enter the outer perimeter, keeping their weapons trained on the visitors at all times. The adapted produced strange items: glowing fungi, shards of what looked like polished obsidian, and vials of a viscous liquid that shimmered in the dim light. The Enclave's scientists would later study these items, searching for anything that could prolong Bastion's survival. But not all interactions were so restrained. Eli remembered the night the adapted attacked in force, overwhelming the guards and breaching the outer defenses. They had come not to trade but to conquer, driven by instincts that Eli could only guess at. The memory of that night haunted him, the screams of his comrades mingling with the deafening rain as Bastion's walls shook under the assault. It had taken every weapon the Enclave possessed to repel the invaders, and the cost had been staggering. Dozens of lives lost, and the walls were weakened, patched together with salvaged materials that wouldn't hold forever. The Enclave's leader, a pragmatic woman named Dr. Marion Cross, understood this better than anyone. She was a biologist turned engineer, her brilliance tempered by the harsh realities of survival. It was she who had devised the domes and the filtration systems, who had led the efforts to keep humanity alive in a world that seemed intent on erasing them. But even she could not deny the inevitable. The rains would not stop, the resources would not last, and the adapted would not relent. "Eli," she said one evening, her voice weary but firm, "we need to consider the unthinkable." He raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to elaborate. "Integration," she said, the word heavy with implication. "With the adapted. They've survived out there because they've changed. If we don't adapt, we die." Eli's gut reaction was revulsion. To embrace the mutations that had turned so many into monsters? It was unthinkable. But as he looked into Marion's eyes, he saw the cold logic behind her words. Bastion was dying, its people clinging to a fragile semblance of humanity that the world no longer allowed. Perhaps survival meant letting go of what they once were. The Enclave was divided. Some saw Marion's proposal as betrayal, a surrender to the forces that had destroyed their world. Others saw it as the only path forward. Experiments began in secret, volunteers exposing themselves to the rain in controlled environments, their bodies monitored for signs of change. The results were both promising and horrifying. Some developed enhanced senses, their eyesight and hearing attuned to the dim, wet world outside. Others succumbed to the mutations, their minds unraveling as their bodies twisted into unrecognizable shapes. Eli was among the volunteers. He'd spent his life defending Bastion, and if this was what it took to ensure its survival, he would do it. The rain burned as it touched his skin, a searing pain that gave way to numbness. Over weeks, he felt his body changing. His muscles became denser, his reflexes sharper. He could see farther in the gloom, hear the faintest rustle of movement. But the changes came at a cost. His skin took on a grayish hue, and his once clear voice grew rough and rasping. He was becoming one of them. As more of Bastion's inhabitants underwent the transformation, the line between human and adapted blurred. The Enclave became a hybrid society, its people no longer fully one thing or the other. The adapted outside grew less hostile, perhaps sensing a kinship with those they had once sought to destroy. Tentative alliances were formed, and for the first time in decades, there was a glimmer of hope. But hope is a fragile thing in a world without sunlight. The rains continued, unrelenting, as if to remind humanity that they were no longer masters of this planet. The new society that emerged in Bastion was a testament to resilience, but it was also a sobering reminder of what had been lost. The sun, the stars, the simple joy of feeling warm and dry. These were things the new generation would never know. Eli stood at his post, now a shadow of the man he once was, but more attuned to the world than ever before. Through the rain, he saw the faint outline of distant mountains, their peaks shrouded in mist. Somewhere beyond them lay answers, perhaps even salvation. But for now, there was only the rain, the darkness, and the unyielding will to survive.